On the evening of September 25, 1974, King Crimson played their final concert at the Palace Theater in Providence, Rhode Island. Most of the band didn't know it was the last one until Robert Fripp told them after the show. The decision had been building for months, and when it came quietly, the way most irreversible decisions do. The album they had just finished recording, Red, would be released 6 weeks later. It would be greeted with critical respect, modest sales, and the particular confusion that attaches itself to records that arrive slightly ahead of where the culture is willing to go. It would take 30 years and the emergence of an entirely different genre of heavy music for the full weight of what that lineup had built to become legible. This is not a story about what King Crimson lost. It is a story about what the rest of music quietly inherited. The King Crimson that recorded Red in the summer of 1974 had been together for less than 2 years. In that time, they had produced 3 studio albums, toured almost continuously, and developed a collective approach to rhythm and texture that had no precedent in rock music, and, as it would turn out, no immediate successors. Robert Fripp, the band's founder and only constant member, was 33 years old, and by his own account, spiritually and physically exhausted. He had been running King Crimson for 5 years through a series of complete lineup changes. Only the name and his own guitar remained constant. The band had become, in his phrase, a monster, a machine that consumed musicians and produced albums and toured relentlessly. He increasingly felt that continuing it meant sacrificing something he was not prepared to sacrifice. John Wetton had joined in late 1972. He brought to the band a bass technique unlike anything working in progressive rock at the time. Where most prog bassists of the era functioned as harmonic support, walking underneath keyboards and guitar, filling the low end, Wetton used his instrument offensively. His bass on the Red era recordings is distorted, overdriven, riff-generating. On One More Red Nightmare, it carries the song's central melodic argument. On Starless, the 12-minute closer that is probably the most formally ambitious piece this lineup recorded, his bass lines function as a second lead voice, not accompanying the drama, but generating it. Bill Bruford had left Yes in 1972, at the height of that band's commercial success, specifically to join King Crimson. He has been candid about why. He wanted complexity of a kind that a conventional rock drumming context could not provide. What he was pursuing in this period was rhythmic displacement, patterns in which the implied downbeat and the actual downbeat are not the same thing, in which meter is treated as a variable rather than a constant. The effect is a music that seems perpetually in the process of resolving, generating forward momentum not through propulsion, but through controlled instability. David Cross, the youngest member, contributed mellotron, violin, and electric piano. The mellotron in his hands was not providing the orchestral warmth that characterized the instrument elsewhere in progressive rock. His string textures on Starless do not soothe, they crowd. They add density to a piece already under enormous structural pressure, making the music feel confined, cornered, on the verge of collapse. That sensation is not accidental, it is crafted. The Red sessions also brought in a number of former members as guests: Mel Collins on saxophone, Ian MacDonald on horn arrangements, Mark Charig on cornet. Their contributions to the title track in particular give it a quality that sounds less like a rock record and more like a chamber work that has been run through a furnace. The Fracture, when it came, was not a failure. It was a rupture at peak creative pressure. And the question of what this lineup would have built next is not merely academic. Fracture runs for 11 minutes and 41 seconds. It has no chorus, no verse structure, no resolution in any conventional sense. And if you removed the date from the recording and played it to someone familiar with modern technical metal, they would not place it in 1974. It is built on a series of intervallic motifs, angular, atonal, anti-melodic in the conventional sense, played with a precision that has no real precedent in rock guitar. The tempo is not steady. The meter is not constant. The piece uses rhythmic structure as a compositional argument rather than as a framework. These are not characteristics of the progressive rock of its era. They are characteristics of a music that did not yet have a name. The studio albums are the band's controlled statements. The live recordings show where they went when the arrangement was lifted. The evidence is in The Great Deceiver, the 4-disc box set released in 1992 that documents the 1973 and 1974 tours in substantial detail. What you hear in the extended improvisations, some lasting 20 minutes or more, is a music that has moved well past the conventions of progressive rock into territory the period had no language for. There are passages in that material that sound closer to industrial music than to anything on Close to the Edge or Brain Salad Surgery. The noise is intentional. The abrasion is the point. Bruford has spoken about the influence of jazz, specifically post-bop and free jazz, on his thinking during this period. But the results in a rock context sound nothing like jazz. Played through the volume and physicality of a touring rock band, his metric displacement and use of the kit as a tuned percussion ensemble produced something that resembles what drum machines in industrial music were attempting to replicate 10 years later. Rhythm as force, rather than rhythm as groove. Wetton's bass is the clearest single sonic link between what this lineup was doing and the texture of modern heavy music. The distorted, riff-based approach fully realized on the Red sessions is the direct ancestor of the rhythmically aggressive bass register that characterizes djent and technical death metal. This is not a vague stylistic resemblance. The tonal palette is nearly identical. The difference is production technology. What Wetton was arriving at through Marshall amplification and playing technique, modern producers achieve through processing and extended range tuning. Starless, 12.5 minutes, closing the album that closes this version of the band, is the fullest statement of where they had arrived. It moves from a lyrical, almost pastoral opening through an extended middle section of increasing rhythmic density and harmonic tension, and arrives at a final passage in which all instruments are driving simultaneously toward a resolution that keeps being deferred. The climax, when it finally comes, has the quality of controlled demolition. It is one of the most precisely engineered pieces of music the rock idiom produced in the 1970s. And the reason it sounds timeless is not mystical. It is structural. The architecture does not belong to a decade. It belongs to a set of principles that remain available to any musician willing to apply them. The connections between the 1974 Crimson and the modern heavy music movements are not abstract. They are traceable, and in several cases the musicians involved have traced them explicitly. Tomas Haka, the drummer of Meshuggah, has cited King Crimson as a direct influence. Meshuggah's work from Destroy, Erase, Improve 1995 onward effectively redefined the rhythmic possibilities of heavy music, and the core of what they did, the polyrhythmic density, the use of meter as a variable rather than a fixed container, the treatment of rhythm as the primary compositional argument, is Bruford's approach followed to its logical conclusion in a heavier sonic environment and a lower tuning register. The machine-like quality that Meshuggah introduced into metal is not a departure from what Bruford was doing in 1974. It is a continuation. Danny Carey, the drummer of Tool, has spoken about Bruford's influence in interviews. Tool's approach to metric complexity, the use of asymmetric time signatures, not as a display of technical skill, but as a compositional tool for controlling emotional pressure, is structurally identical to what Bruford was developing in 1973 and 1974. Lateralis, released in 2001, applies these ideas to a hard rock context with a directness that requires no theoretical translation. The bridge is audible. Tosin Abasi of Animals as Leaders has spoken about Fripp's influence on his approach to the guitar. The connection is immediate on contact. The same preference for angular intervallic lines over smooth melody. The same use of silence as structural punctuation. The same disinterest in the kind of sustained, vibrato-heavy phrasing that dominates most guitar-based music. Fripp's 1974 approach to the instrument did not produce many imitators in rock. It produced instead a small number of musicians who understood what he was doing and followed the logic into genres that did not yet exist. Mikhail Ackerfeldt of Opeth has cited King Crimson repeatedly across 30 years of interviews. What Opeth absorbed from the 1974 lineup, the willingness to move without warning between brutal aggression and sustained melodic beauty, the use of dynamic contrast as a structural device rather than a dramatic effect, is precisely what makes the Red-era recordings feel more like templates than artifacts. They describe an approach rather than a sound. The approach remains usable. What all of these musicians share with the 1974 Crimson is a treatment of difficulty as a positive compositional value. Not difficulty for its own sake, but difficulty as the appropriate register for music that is trying to say something a more comfortable music cannot reach. Robert Fripp reconvened King Crimson in 1981 with an entirely new lineup and a fundamentally different sonic agenda. The clean guitar tones, the Chapman stick, Adrian Belew's expressionistic vocals and heavily processed guitar. The 1981 version had made a deliberate peace with the sonic conventions of its moment. New Wave was at its commercial height. Talking Heads and Peter Gabriel were the cultural reference points. It was a refined music, and it aged the way refined music ages, with distinction, but with clear date stamps. The Red-era recordings have not aged in the same way. Listened to in 2026, they sound less like an artifact of the 1970s and more like a parallel development, as if the heavy music of the last 30 years arrived by two different routes, and one of those routes went through Island Studios, London, in the summer of 1974. Part of this is production. Red was recorded on tape with valve amplification, with the physical noise of musicians playing at the limit of their technique. The saturation and warmth that modern heavy productions spend considerable effort emulating are simply present in the recording, because that is what that equipment sounds like under those conditions. The grain is not nostalgia, it is physics. But the deeper reason is structural. Metric displacement does not go out of fashion. Angular intervallic melody does not date. The use of rhythm as the primary compositional argument, rather than as supporting infrastructure, is as relevant in 2026 as it was in 1974. These are not stylistic choices. They are fundamental approaches to how music can be organized, and they do not belong to the decade in which they were first applied at this level of rigor. When the remastered edition of Red was released in 2009 and reviewed alongside contemporary heavy music, more than one critic noted that the production sounded competitive with records being made that year. That observation gets at something real. The album was not ahead of its time in the vague, promotional sense. It was operating on principles that time does not erode. The 1981 Crimson was in conversation with 1981. The 1974 Crimson was in conversation with a future that hadn't declared itself yet. What follows is inference, not history, an attempt to extrapolate from documented evidence toward a question that has no answer. Had King Crimson not dissolved in September 1974, the album following Red would, by all indications, have pushed further into the territory the band was already mapping. The improvisations from the 1974 tour document a group moving toward greater noise, greater abrasion, a more systematic deployment of dissonance. Bruford's playing was becoming more polyrhythmic, more resistant to conventional pulse. Fripp's interest in systems and formal structures, later channeled through his engagement with Gurdjieff's teachings and developed practically through the Guitarcraft program, was already shaping how he thought about musical organization. The hypothetical record would almost certainly have been the most formally uncompromising thing this lineup produced, a document from the place where progressive rock's intellectual rigor and heavy music's physical brutality meet. Whether the market of 1975 could have received such a record is a different question. The progressive rock bubble was already deflating. Punk was 2 years away. The cultural infrastructure that sustained long, expensive, demanding rock records was closing. What is not in question is what happened to the music itself. It scattered into Fripp's solo work and the Guitarcraft project, into Bruford's own groups Bruford and later Earthworks, where he continued developing the polyrhythmic ideas this version of Crimson had established. It entered the bloodstream of musicians who heard Red and followed the logic forward without a map. Fripp walked off stage in Providence knowing the band was finished. What he could not have known is that the unfinished project he was leaving behind had already been received. The musicians who would complete it in their own idiom and on their own terms were not yet playing. Some of them were not yet born. The Ghost in the Machine is not the album that was never made. It is the music that was made anyway, in fragments, over decades, by people who heard something in Fracture or Starless or One More Red Nightmare and understood, without necessarily being able to articulate it, that the direction was correct, that the brutalism was not an aberration, that this was not the end of something.